Hi there, and welcome back for our next lesson of APUS history. Today we are going to be going through an Age of Reform, topic 4.11 in the APUSH curriculum. I'm your APUSH lady boss. I'm glad you're here. Go ahead and click down in the description to grab some access to some follow along notes as you watch this video. We want to stay really focused on learning Objective K, which says to explain how and why various reform movements developed and expanded from 1800 to 1848. In the curriculum, they are going to emphasize what is leading to these reform movements, thinking about things like the market revolution, the Second Great Awakening, utopian movements. And then we are going to be looking at some particular types of reform movements: the temperance movement, abolitionists and anti-slavery, and the women's rights movement especially. So, to jump in, we're going to do a little historical context, a little review of what's causing the reform movements. We're going to dive into the specifics of a few of them and then go over the effects. So, for historical context, the main thing that you want to be aware of is how the Second Great Awakening led to reform movements. So, what we see happening in this antebellum period, this time period of before the war, before the Civil War, where we see this rise of religious fervor. There's various things like rising debates over slavery, territorial expansion, lots of things that are causing people to kind of shift their thinking and become more religious. And as they become more religious, they're listening to the ministers as they talk about how they should be alleviating social ills and eradicating moral vices. Basically, it's not enough just to go to church, you have to actually act like a good person as well. That's how I think about the Second Great Awakening and how it leads to the reform movements. So, the first movement we want to talk about is temperance. Temperance is very similar to the prohibition movement that you might be more familiar with in the 1900s. But basically, the people of the time period of the antebellum era had an extremely high rate of consumption. It's the main leisure activity for men. And there was a strong connection between the levels of alcohol and crime, disorder, and poverty. And so the temperance movement goal is to stop the drinking of alcohol. There's some pretty amazing political cartoons, pamphlets, things that were happening in the time period for people to illustrate their opinions about the issue. So, high participation by women because women were not allowed to control their wages. They were kind of at the whims of their men. And if their men were drinking a lot, it left them in a difficult situation. So, the movement was very effective for the time period, with 14 states banning the drinking of alcohol. This was the most popular of the reform movements. Here are some very popular images from the time period: the drunkard's progress, or the direct road to poverty, wretchedness, and ruin. So you can see how the man goes from drinking in the morning to then going to the grog shop. He's a confirmed drunkard. His family is a mess. And then in the last scene, they're leaving their home. They probably weren't able to pay for it and lost it. Here's another one, a little more extreme: the drunkard's progress from first glass to the grave. So showing how just the first glass isn't a big deal, but then it becomes a habit, a disease, and then it leads to their eventual death. So very powerful images of the time period. The next major reform movement that we're going to talk about is anti-slavery and abolition. And this is going to be really covered in the next couple lessons as well. So here's kind of a brief overview to this. Now, anti-slavery and abolition are actually not the same thing. Anti-slavery is more focused on eliminating the slavery that already exists. For example, there's a group called the American Colonization Society, and this sounds contradictory, but the American Colonization Society was actually racist. They believed that the problems in America were caused by the fact that there were African Americans and white people living in the same space. And so their goal was to move African Americans out of America and send them to Africa. And so there's various times in American history where there's like a back to Africa movement, where there's efforts to make America basically white. So That's the anti-slavery movement. Abolition would be more focused on emancipating and ending slavery, but then having African Americans obtain certain rights in America as well. So, in this period, we have a lot of Western expansion. We have the growth of the cotton industry, making it so that slavery is rapidly expanding and growing. But we also have European influences. Some European countries, like Britain, are ending slavery. And so that abolition movement that's happening overseas is influencing some abolitionists in the United States. So the goal is to end slavery. And there's going to be a variety of ways this happens, sometimes by urging slave revolts, issuing pamphlets, newspapers, lectures. This is a Liberator newspaper that was an abolitionist newspaper. There was another one called the North Star by Frederick Douglass. Lots of major speeches by people like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman. So many abolitionists at this time growing in prominence and getting their voice heard through lectures and speeches. Additionally, the Underground Railroad was growing in significance. And some states, like Massachusetts, actually refused to extradite accused fugitive slaves. So sometimes a African American would run away to the free North, and then they would be required by law to be extradited or sent back. And some states refused to do that. So, effectiveness. What we see happening is by the eve of the Civil War, most northern states are committed to emancipation, but whether it was immediate emancipation or gradual emancipation varies by state. And there is a slow increase in public sentiment against slavery. However, most people are not ardent abolitionists and are also very against giving lots of rights to African Americans. So it's one thing to want to end slavery, it's another thing to support equal rights. So that balance will continue to be debated throughout American history. All right, the last major movement the College Board emphasizes is the women's rights movement. So, how this really develops in 1848 is that white abolitionist women, so white women who were attempting to engage in reform work, especially in the abolition movement, were refused equal participation. So, they couldn't participate in various conferences, they couldn't vote on legislation, they couldn't really access property or wages to use that to help the movements. And so they determined that they must have rights themselves in order to support the rights of other people. So the goal is equality for women. And the main term that you need to be familiar with is the Seneca Falls Convention. This is going to be the very first convention on women's rights. And at this convention, they wrote what's called the Declaration of Sentiments. And this was a extremely important document that mirrors the Declaration of Independence. It has a lot of similar language, but it applies it to the rights of women. Additionally, women are using newspapers, magazines, pamphlets, letter writing, all of that to grow their network and obtain equal rights for women. Connections with women's rights groups overseas were also developing. Effectiveness. The convention happens in 1848, and as we know, the Civil War begins in 1860. And so, really, the movement isn't very effective in period 4. If we're thinking about how effective was the women's rights movement up to 1848, well, not really, because it had the first convention by 1848. So, it's overshadowed by the crisis for slavery. However, this convention and their eventual work is an inspiration for generations of feminists and future women's rights groups. All right, brief introduction to a few other movements happening at the same time. Public asylums were gaining a lot of attention as many people with mental illness or struggling with mental health were forced to live in wretched conditions and regularly abused. And so reformers like Dorothea Dix were discovering this, and public support grew for publicly funded institutions. And so these would be separate facilities dedicated to supporting the needs of people struggling with mental health. Prisons. We see an idea of penitentiaries developing. So, this is an idea that's really going to focus on moral instruction, trying to get people to reform their attitudes and then their behavior. What we do see, though, is that they decided to use solitary confinement to encourage people to reflect on their behavior, which had an extremely negative impact, and that eventually went away. It still exists in some situations. It's just not as prominent as it was in the time period. Another major reform movement is the education movement. So the big one we see happening is the establishment of free public schools. So an emphasis on school being available to all people and having compulsory or required attendance. Additionally, teachers should be better prepared. And then there were some specialty schools that were developed for people with disabilities and more higher education opportunities, especially for women. So, there's just a brief introduction to some of these other movements that we see. And a quote by Dorothea Dix, she says, "In a world where there is so much to be done, I felt strongly impressed that there must be something for me to do." And so, kind of encompassing this idea that people felt a need, a desire to improve their situation and the situation of other people. So, effects. The largest reforms that happen are going to be present in northern western states because Southerners viewed this as a threat to their way of life. Remember, a lot of these movements are trying to gain national momentum, and many Southern states are going to be really emphasizing the state's control and states' rights. Some of the efforts increased the rights of individuals or attempted to, like abolition and women's rights. However, others actually restricted personal liberties, like the temperance movement. So we see kind of that idea of democracy, personal liberty, kind of being conflicting at this time. What ends up happening is the sectional crisis over slavery dominates social and political concerns. So a lot of these reform movements we see experience a lot of growth in the 30s and 40s and then kind of get subdued in the 50s, but then they'll make their appearance again later in American history. And so really these movements are setting the precedent and foundation for future movements. There definitely was successes in the time period, but all of those are going to be expanded upon in the later decades. So I hope this was helpful for you for understanding how reform movements developed and expanded. And if so, please like and subscribe.